get started. Just a couple announcements first. There's still coffee and there's a kettle if anybody wants to make tea in the back with some cookies. And if you're looking for washrooms, they're downstairs. There's an elevator to the right. Just go down to the basement, or you can take the stairs on the left. And there's 2 washrooms down there if you're looking for the washrooms. So my name's Tim. I'm the National Coordinator with the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. And I'll introduce Paul more, but this is Paul, the author of the book, Why We're Here Tonight, When Poverty Mattered. And just to start off, I'd also like to acknowledge that we are gathering tonight on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And we recognize that in our work at ICLMG because so much of the work that we do right now is about the surveillance of Indigenous peoples and recognizing the history of the RCMP and Security Services in Canada of the original colonization project. And so we try to keep that as a part of the work that we do here. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Just note that we're going to live stream the event, so we'll be recording it. If ever anyone's uncomfortable with that, just let us know, especially during the Q&A, and we can always pause it or stop it. But we just thought it would be good to share it more publicly and also have a recording of the event for afterwards for reference and be able to share what we talked about tonight. So I'm going to start just by introducing Paul a little bit and why ICLMG is interested in the book, and then Paul's going to do a reading, and we'll have a bit of a Q&A up here, and then we'll have lots of time for questions afterwards as well. Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump into it. So just to introduce Paul a bit, Paul has worked in journalism most of his life, primarily as a freelance writer. He has written for newspapers such as the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Daily Star, and the Hamilton Spectator, for weeklies including Now Magazine and iMagazine, and a range of publications including The Report on Business, This Magazine, and the CCPA Monitor. He currently lives in Hamilton, where he is editing an upcoming collection of articles about the city of Hamilton. I work with the ICLMG, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. We're a coalition of 45 groups across the country, 46 now actually, that came together in 2002 after the adoption of the first National Anti-Terrorism Act in Canada. And we came together in the acknowledgement that the reaction to the tragedy that happened in New York on 9/11, but the legislation that was coming in, the rhetoric that was coming in, was clearly going to be overreaching and impacting our civil liberties around freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion and movement. And there were multiple groups that wanted to take action and so came together to form this watchdog coalition. And so since 2002, we've worked to monitor the impact of national security legislation on civil liberties, both in Canada and Canada's role internationally, under the guise of the war on terror. Currently, a lot of our work is on issues such as the no-fly list, the powers that CSIS currently has, Canada's main spy agency, and we'll be talking about that tonight. And that's really how our work kind of ties into and how we got to talking with Paul about the book and organizing tonight is because of the similarities and reflections that we have about what was happening in the late 1960s with the RCMP Security Service and what we're seeing right now with CSIS and the growing powers that they're being granted. So I don't think I'll say much more. Just if you are interested in our work, you can find us at iclmg.ca. We have a weekly newsletter that you can sign up for, the News Digest. And we're completely funded by organizations and by individuals. We don't take any government funding. So if you are interested in supporting our work, you can find out how on our website as well. So without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to Paul.
You might want to add that I'll be signing books afterwards.
Oh, of course, yeah. So don't rush out. Paul will be signing books, and there's books for sale. Thank you to Octopus Books for being here tonight. Sorry, I didn't even... And just so acknowledge, yeah, so tonight is co-organized with Octopus Books and with Fernwood Publishing, the publisher of the book. So, yeah, definitely pick up a book. Paul will be signing books. And if they're not able to buy a book tonight, they're available for purchase online as well?
Well, they can go directly to Octopus Books. They'll have some in stock. They can also order online from either Fernwood or the distributor.
Okay, great.
And you can find that out on the website, I think.
On Fernwood
on
Publishing.
The announcement, yeah. Okay, you want me to start reading?
Yeah.
Okay, so the scene is Toronto, late 60s. We call
officer conducting, in his words, discreet surveillance, that's a quote, for the RCMP Security and Intelligence Branch, SIB, in the fall of 1969, was standing in front of a semi-detached house on leafy Huron Street, just south of the University of Toronto campus. We don't know if the students walking on their way to class took any notice of this person jotting down notes. Days earlier, the newspaper had reported that the Just Society movement, then a high-profile poor people's group, was moving into this address to take up space with other activist organizations. The same SIB officer wrote the following about the other attached house, quote, several, capital U, capital M, which meant unidentified males, wearing beards, etc., were observed entering number 371, and it would be seen it is a rooming house for university types of the hippie caliber, quote. Now, but the main interest with the primary tenant at 373 Huron, the Praxis Corporation Research Institute for Social Change, which was leasing the house from the University of Toronto, the owner of many houses on the street. The same or a different investigator, it's not clear, recorded the following observation a month later, quote, it is increasingly evident that organizations of this nature and stature are deserving of our attention. Failure to do so will leave us sadly lacking in being able to comment about the impetus behind social unrest, at the grassroots level, quote. So, rather inauspiciously begins the forgotten story of Praxis, an independent research organization focused on social issues, community organizing, and education. And it's been dealt with briefly in some historical accounts about the RCMP Security Service. I should say here that SIB, RCMP Security Service are the same thing, they just have different names. This begins a story that looks at Praxis and the anti-poverty movement. Now I'm not reading anymore, I'm just providing the context of what my book is about. Praxis was under surveillance for 3 years during its existence, and a number of things happened to it. At the same time, the reason why this is occurring is it was part of a large movement, approximately 200 organizations across Canada representing poor people that kind of sprung up. This was part of the late 60s, early 70s community organizing of various kinds. And so that's how my book starts.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think that's a great introduction to where the book kind of leads us into what this poor people's movement was in the late 60s and what the security services interests were and how it kind of led to kind of attempts to undermine and surveil the organization. But I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about where the book goes and kind of what generally the book kind of covers. Yeah.
Well, what I did is I write about my book is an intersection of the poverty issue and national security at the time. So Praxis was just a small organization, about 50 people at the most, but there was a lot of concern by the people in Ottawa. We're talking about Privy Council, we're talking about certain cabinet ministers, we're talking about part of the RCMP Security Service, and Privy Council had its own security group within it, about this tiny organization. Why were they obsessed about it? And it seems comical today when you read the memos, but there was the conspiracy minded element in it. But I also decided, talked to the publisher, and they suggested put in a broader context of the anti-poverty movement at the time, and poverty was a big issue in the 60s in a way that we can't imagine today. And part of it was discovering that there were poor people in Canada. That was a big shock to the political psyche in Ottawa, and it started in Washington because Lyndon Johnson unleashed a war on poverty to deal with unrest in big American cities. And it kind of flowed into Canada, the same issue, because Canada was introducing a welfare state, and under Lester Pearson's minority government, 65, Canada announced its own war on poverty, and through the new social welfare system called Canada Assistance Plan. but it was an incomplete war on poverty because the rates were very low, lots of rules, and very difficult if you were on welfare and social assistance, and hence these anti-poverty groups started. So I kind of go into that. I looked at three groups. I looked at Praxis, doing the organizing and the research. And I looked at the Just Society Movement, which is a group of women on welfare primarily, and that was a growing group of women leaving their, abusive husbands in many cases, and having to fend for themselves with kids, and also they had some injured workers who couldn't, and the workers' compensation, just as today it's a problem, it was also a problem then in terms of getting proper, any kind of remuneration. So I looked at them, and I also looked at a group called the Hamilton Welfare Rights Organization, which was similar. Now, there were other groups across Canada, but I just focused on the three. I also looked at stuff coming out of Ottawa, and I also interviewed people in Vancouver. So I tried to give it a bit of a national scope. So then that's part of the book, and then I get into the Praxis story. There's all kinds of things that go on. There's a break-in, a mysterious break-in, and the burglars have never been arrested, but the documents that were stolen in this house for Praxis, the house that's described here, end up in the RCMP Security Service for 6 years, hence a tale. So I don't want to wreck the whole story. I want to give a little bit of something.
Yeah, not too many spoilers, but we'll get into a bit of some of the
Spoiler
implications later on. But it is interesting how it builds a bit of that mystery, and you do kind of weave this idea of is it possible to really know in these situations, who authorized or whether or not it was an authorized action or exactly
burglary.
Yeah, the
burglary and fire. So the house that I'm describing, it had a bunch of different groups. In there was the Stop Spadina, which was a group fighting a major expressway that would go from the north to the south to the lake, and it was called the Spadina Expressway. And actually there were proposals for a whole bunch of expressways. In every city, I think, a lot of cities had a similar kind of debate. So there was a Stop Spadina movement. What made it unique is that there was a lot of people, professors, lived in the annex area, and they had a lot of influence, I think, and they led a campaign to stop the expressway. And Praxis had some links to it, to that organization, or similar. Jane Jacobs, you may know, the urban writer, first came to Canada. She got involved with Praxis and then was Stop Spadina. So they were kind of there were kind of connections between the two of them. So this house had all these different groups, Just Society, and there were tenants groups. There was a women's group actually as well. So and suddenly they became the subject of this burglary fire. There was a fire set. Those documents are stolen. I try to find out who did it, and they'll try to do as much detective work. It isn't easy. There were no files. No one was charged, but I did interview members of the extreme right-wing group that many people agreed probably were responsible for the break-in. And this wasn't an easy thing to do. Interview they're unrepentant white nationalist racist types, and I'm Jewish, but it was a bit of I managed to talk to them anyway, and of course, you can only believe people so much, so I had to get confirmation by talking to journalists. I did have a source in the RCMP who's now retired. I spoke to, and then I quoted whatever documents I could clean.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Maybe before we go a bit more into the, what the security agencies were doing and everything, it's an interesting story. But I guess one question would be what led you into this? Like you said, Praxis. It's not a very well-known story. How did you kind of come across it and ended up? I think you spent a decade working on this book. How did it?
Well, the decade is because I started working on it because I sort of ran into this lawyer named Paul Copeland. He's quite well known, particularly in Toronto, with cases involving the RCMP and immigration. He's kind of a 60s type lawyer. I mean, he started off putting together a manual for draft dodgers. If they can know what they could expect. And I think it's been republished. So it's a kind of historical document. And he worked with Clay Ruby, another lawyer at the time, and so I would run into him and ask, well, I knew there was a guy who had been involved with Praxis, was writing his own book, because I had met up with him a couple of decades earlier. So said, you know, this is he was suing the RCMP. There's a guy named Howard Bookbinder. He'd been a key person at Praxis, and he was suing the RCMP. You know, I said, well, this is interesting. Could I interview you? And he was kind of gruff. He said, no, I'm doing my own book, because it was kind of his. The whole thing, the story was all over. He was teaching university. This happened to him 10 years earlier, and he wanted to recount the story. Well, he never wrote the book, or never wrote anything about it. So I ran into Copeland. I was curious, well, what happened to that book? Well, it never got written. So I thought, well, maybe there's a story. But I wasn't sure if it was a book or not, so I was researching it. And Paul Copeland got me introduced to Bookbinder's son, who there was apparently voluminous files in someone's basement. Because Howard Bookbinder wanted to get someone to write the book when he couldn't do it himself. And various people he tried to recruit, but it didn't get written. So, and in fact, they ended up stored in my basement in Toronto, where I used to live. So that's kind of how it got started, and it took a few years only. Well, first it was a difficult subject, accessing documents, and then I wrote a couple of articles for it, and sort of publications, very specialized publications. But then I didn't know where to take it, and I couldn't find a publisher that was interested, and so I kind of forgot about it for a few years, and then Fernwood called me 5 years after I may have sent them a proposal, asked me if I was still interested. It sounds unusual, but I guess these things happen. They pile up in people's shelves, and so then I went to it. But then the publisher gave me some ideas of how to expand it, I thought.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it did get made after all that time that Howard Bookbinder was going to.
He's passed away.
It's an interesting piece of history to be able to and to compare to what's going on right now.
Yeah, well, I think that's what was important to me, is that I think it's not. This is like a long time ago. It's in the '60s, and people forget these things. But then you see similar events today, so I think that's what occurred to me, that there are parallels.
Yeah. Before we get into some of the parallels today, it's interesting to look back at what the anti-poverty movement was, and you mentioned a little bit already about why it was important, but today we don't see the same kind of surveillance of the anti-poverty movement necessarily. No. What was it at that time that kind of got them so much on the government's radar, as you were saying, Praxis being a small organization?
Well, I think what happened is that the security service and the politicians in Ottawa were worried that the violence in American cities involving, and I don't know, you can call them uprisings essentially, and there were Afro-Americans who were frustrated with racism and wasn't enough progress despite the legislation that passed by the Voters' Rights Act and the civil rights legislation passed by the U.S. Congress. And what happened, I found a speech by Pierre Trudeau after he got elected. It was at Queen's University, and this was considered quite an insightful speech. He was saying, Canada shouldn't be worried about the Cold War and about the Russians. We should be concerned about what's going on in North America, and we should be concerned about the violence in American cities spreading up here. And he named two groups where we should be concerned about where there could be potential violence, and he named Indigenous group people, and who just gotten their citizenship. They, Indigenous people on First Nations land, or we call them reserves, they got their citizenship in 1960. So we're talking about a speech in 1968. And he just got elected in 1968. This is Pierre Trudeau. And he made this speech, so he said, poor people, he said, peons in our own country may start revolting. We may see violence from Indigenous people. So now he was wrong about those two, and it was funny because in that speech he said the one place he didn't see any violence happening was in Quebec. And he didn't see any problems with the separatists in Quebec. This is 1 year before the October crisis. So he's kind of myopic on all counts. So, but this was and you look at the files, see, it is a theme that, and they thought anything that might, and I think what they saw what was more threatening were academics causing poor people to want to become militant. They weren't as it looked like the RCMP weren't as afraid of poor people as they were afraid of the academics who might get them all riled up.
Right. Yeah, and that's I find it interesting part of you quote really extensively from the RCMP files that you're able to look at, and I'd like to find if you could talk a bit now about even how you got your hands on those. But one of the things that jumps out is how they seem almost obsessed with the influence that a small group of academics are going to have on government officials, on poor people at large, and,
Yeah.
and that they're somehow going to foment this violent revolution.
Yeah. Okay, well, what happened is that I discovered that there was a particular interest in University of Toronto because it goes back to the founding of the CCF, the League of Social Reconstruction, and then groups after that. These were left-wing academics, and they weren't all members of the CCF or the NDP. They might even been left-wing members of the Liberal Party like Stephen Clarkson or someone like Abraham Rossian. These are names that may not be, you have to be a certain generation memory to know who these people are. But Stephen Clarkson was married to Adrienne Clarkson, the former Governor General, at that time, and they had a very bad breakup. But when they were married together, they were like the power couple. Like the CBC did a profile of them, and Stephen Clarkson was somebody who seemed like he was going to go somewhere. And he founded Praxis. He also ran for mayor. He did a bunch of things, and he wrote a book on Trudeau. So anyway, I can't remember what your question.
Well, just
going on.
Just a little bit about what was it that they thought. It's almost kind of
what I'm
what was
saying
it that
is
they
they
thought
were
was this influence these people.
I think
was going to
that's
have.
right. They saw there were all these academics. They saw the U of T as a festering place of potential. That these people were influencing government, and the RCMP since the 1917 Russian Revolution, it was formally set up to deal with communism, and for them anything that was left wing was related to communism. They didn't distinguish between NDP, Communist Party, if you're an anarchist or Trotskyist or whatever, or New Left. It was all part of the same kind of mix. Women's movement, it was all part of this. And U of T was considered a source for some of this stuff. So when Praxis came out of the U of T but was not part of the university, they saw it as threatening.
Right. Okay. So, do you think that how you frame how they saw Praxis as a national security threat there, what kind of lessons do you think we can take from how the RCMP and the Security Service then was looking at Praxis, and look at how we see security services operating today?
Well, I did my own freelancing. I did an article about CSIS conducting home visits of Muslim families. Actually, that seemed to be a target group, and I spoke to an academic who's an expert on this, Jeffrey Monahan at University of Ottawa. And he was saying, the CSIS actually issues threat assessments of there are certain groups they regard as threats in Canada, and poor people are not one of them today, and neither is the left. Left is not, or labor is not considered a threat than it was in the 60s. And so it was interesting. It was different groups, and it occurred to me that every generation there's another perceived threat, but it's always different. Like since 9/11, it's been terrorism, it's Muslim families, and then with protests around pipelines and oil and gas, the environmental movement, indigenous people. So every generation there's a different issue, and there's different perceived threats, I think.
Okay. One of the things that resonated with me is that we still have concerns today about police infiltration and informants of left-wing and progressive organizations, of groups that are considered radicals. And you talk about, some of the ways that the RCMP, and the government tried to keep tabs on what Praxis and other anti-poverty movements were doing, both them and through, some of the, like you mentioned, the extreme right-wing groups, in this case, the Burke Society. Can you talk a little bit more about, how back then, what were some of the ways that RCMP and the Security Service were trying to keep tabs on and get information about the organization?
Well, I think they probably did have informants. They did have informants in the Burke Society for sure. And there's what was the relationship between the RCMP and the extreme right is an interesting question, a difficult question. One historian I interviewed said that it was the Burke Society got these documents, and then it was like being a freelance writer. They offered their services. But here's a great story. Would you like to have it? But other people I've talked to feel that the Burke Society was a tiny group. They didn't really have their act together to do this seamless, very well executed burglary. had to be some kind of relationship, and none of them were ever charged, and the police didn't seem to be very interested in going after the burglars. So that kind of interested me, this relationship. Now, in terms of informants, I talk about meetings where I have memos where they would go to, let's say Praxis would challenge, we had a whole campaign at the Social Planning Council, which was a body doing research about poverty and social issues in Toronto. Every city had a social planning council. It's quite common. So Toronto had its own thing, and it was quite a conservative organization. It was run by the United Appeal, and they didn't really research poverty. Their role was to collect information on the social agencies that were providing services. So there were a group of people who wanted to run people have a campaign, elect people at an annual general meeting, get people elected to the board, and change the direction of the Social Planning Council. And so I do have memos from Mounties who infiltrated the gathering and infiltrated the kind of the strategy sessions that the Praxis people had so they infiltrated the group. So that's the sample. They would infiltrate meetings, and they would, and it would be easy to go to a meeting like that. Like no one would check, anyone could attend a meeting like that. So that's where I think informants would go and show up.
Right. And I don't have the quotes in front of me, but you mentioned in the book about how it seems at times that they didn't really understand what was going on in the meetings, or they didn't quite kind of, they would exaggerate what people were saying, or it didn't seem like that RCMP agents really even knew what to make sometimes of what they were.
Well, I think that's true, and there's a historian, Steve Hewitt, who's written about this whole period, and he says that often they were just like police officers, the RCMP was made up of police officers and security intelligence, and they often were high school educated. I did meet one Mountie who did come out of York University and joined the RCMP, so there probably were, but they weren't that well educated in terms of political science, or what was the difference, political theory, what does left wing mean, and they weren't highly educated, so I think they were a bit confused. And they got into and they're really prone to conspiracy thinking. Okay. Which kind of, that's part of your job, is to look for conspiracies anyways, that's if you're in that force, so I don't think that happens today, so.
Right. And maybe we can kind of lead that into, the way that we got to talking about it was you reached out to me about current legislation and the current work of CSIS and how maybe it is reflected. I could talk a bit about that, but what ways do you see right now in the news, or what we've been seeing, lately? Do you see kind of parallels to what CSIS is doing now compared to what the RCMP?
I think it's actually more. It's actually because in those days, the RCMP Security Service. I don't have numbers. I don't know how many people, but I don't think it was a huge organization. It probably wasn't more than a few hundred. I don't know. I don't think it was big, but and it was really the security intelligence was really one group. I mean, the military had its own intelligence, but I think it was mostly the security service. Today, apparently, many departments have their own security intelligence. It's federal government departments. You have the RCMP. Now, what happened is that security intelligence in the RCMP was split off and became CSIS. But the RCMP still does security intelligence. Mm-hmm. And there was a piece in the press recently about a woman who was her social media was under surveillance, and I can't remember. You know the case, Rachel Small.
Yeah, Rachel Small. Yeah.
And I don't know what her activity was, but they were following it, and this is a sample. And they said this is our mandate, which is interesting because supposedly the RCMP doesn't do security intelligence anymore. That is CSIS. That's their job. That's why CSIS was set up. But they've become kind of rival organizations. Mm-hmm. It's like the RCMP has its own security intelligence. They've owned security service over again, even though it's supposed to be disbanded. And then you discover, and there's been some reporting on this, particularly the National Observer, that there are other departments, and part of it is because of the relation between the oil and gas industry and the government. It's considered a key part of the economy, and oil and gas industry. They're concerned about the activities of people who are opposed to pipelines, and there's been some surveillance and communication between the government and there seems to be some surveillance going on, and what happens is that they go talk to people. This is what happens in the 60s, where security service people will go talk to people to get information. Like they'll talk to people in Praxis, is what they would do at the time, which is very intimidating. And I wrote an article about Muslim families members of the Muslim community being asked to be informants. And they were afraid of, if someone comes to your door, you're going to be pressured being an informant on your own community, and that's very intimidating. So you can see this sort of parallels, I think.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting, and in a lot of the work that we've been doing lately, we see those kind of parallels too. The RCMP's kind of intelligence work. There's Project Sitka that they had, which was basically developing profiles on Indigenous activists.
Yeah.
And it came out, and they had said that in 2014 that they had shuttered the project, and when people kind of raised concerns about it, that it wasn't happening anymore. And then it came out just recently that a new access to information request found out that it was still ongoing 2 years later, but under a different name and under kind of a different department within the RCMP and regional police, and that they had kind of reinitialized the list.
Yeah.
So even when they say that those lists and this intelligence that they're gathering, even when it's exposed and they say they're not using it anymore, they never really get rid of it. It's just kind of recycled and brought back when they want to use it.
I mean, I think it's bigger, but then I was also told by Paul Copeland in the early 80s, there were at least 800,000 Canadians were on file. There were files on 800,000 Canadians. I don't know how many files there are in Canadians today, but by all the new technology that's around there, you could conceivably think there'd be a lot more people potentially through the big data that we were talking about at lunch, for the facial recognition. I think we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, what's been happening recently is in recent years with CSIS especially is that they've, on one hand, been gathering more information. I'll talk about that, but also they've been kind of getting more police-like powers. That the original splitting off of CSIS from the RCMP, it was supposed to fix that problem. So what we're seeing now is with Bill C-51 that came in 2015, and what's been happening with the new National Security Act that the Liberals brought in to kind of refine things but basically keep it in place, is that CSIS is being granted powers to do their own kind of disruption. So not just gather information, but to actively, with a warrant, but a secret warrant that's never challenged publicly, to disrupt people's communication, disrupt their movement, and really carry out some of those activities that would have been, were raising questions in the late 60s and early 70s in the Dirty Tricks campaign of the RCMP. It's different now because they do at least have to seek some kind of warrant, which wasn't the issue, which the RCMP wasn't seeking back then. But at the same time,
the Dirty Tricks.
Oh yeah, can you talk about that? Yeah.
Okay, what happened is that after the October crisis, it was suggested that the Canadian government kind of missed the boat. They should have been on top of this security-wise. That there were these bombings going on by the FLQ in Montreal, so what happened is after the October crisis is over, there was pressure on the security service to go after the separatists, whether they were legally constituted or they were the underground FOQ, which was a diminished force after the October crisis. They lost a lot of support. It was the violence, the kidnappings and the killings, and the two killings of Laporte and it's just Laporte. I can't remember.
There was only one killing.
Oh, there were two. There was one person was kidnapped, and one was killed.
Ross was kidnapped and left alive.
But what happened is the security service said, we're going to go after the separatists. Why don't we go after the left as well? That's our specialty. We've got a lot of expertise in that area. Why not take advantage of it? So they expanded their activities, and the new left. This was all these movements, women's movement, student movement, anti-war, all this stuff. And also new Indigenous movements, because Indigenous people were also setting up their organizations, but they weren't interested in the violence scenario that was being put upon them. They wanted to use law. They hired lawyers, and they were very effective actually, because one of the things was this government wanted to take away their treaty rights. They wanted to abolish First Nations reserves and get rid of the treaties, and this was a bit of a, this was Jean Chrétien's idea, and then it was fought and they dropped the idea. So what happened is that the RCMP was let loose and they did a variety of things. The most famous story is the burning of the barn in Quebec. Supposedly the FLQ and the US Black Panthers were going to meet at a barn. So security service operatives burned the barn. Now whether that meeting was actually going to happen, I get the impression it was kind of one of those, stories that really had no basis, but so there were other things they stole. The RCMP stole the membership list of the Parti Québécois, which was a legal organization, wasn't doing anything illegal. They would send felony memos from purportedly from the FLQ. There was a variety of things. People were kidnapped actually, and then interrogated. So Praxis has to put in the context of all these different things. The illegal activity of the RCMP there is holding on to documents, stolen documents for 6 years, not telling the owners of their documents, hey, we have them, we'll give them back to you then. And well, they were. So what happened is that actually it was a Conservative Party justice critic, a guy named Frank Overley, raised the matter of, apparently there was a list circulated within the federal government of purported subversives, civil servants who were disloyal, and they would be warned that they were being watched. We were not going to fire you, but just watch your P's and Q's and stuff. And this was called the enemies list, and then it was revealed this may have come out of the stolen Praxis documents. So then the Praxis story came out that they were stolen, and then suddenly Praxis was a news story. It was they probably received more attention than they did in 1970 when it existed. So this we call the dirty tricks, the RCMP dirty tricks. So that's one of the wrongdoing, and this forming CSIS was supposed to, the RCMP was to clean up their act. It was supposed to be a much more professional security intelligence organization, kind of like CIA, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And we haven't heard of CSIS burning down barns, but what we have heard is with the new CSIS Powers, a colleague of mine kind of put it that they can kind of digitally burn down barns now. They can go to a judge and say, well, in secret, and say, well, we want to take down this website, or we want to post false information on this website to keep these individuals from being able to communicate with each other, so they can't have online meetings or discussions and interfere with communications. That way, you mentioned sending false memos and messages and missives that they would be able to, with a warrant, CSIS can now do that. And these are all kind of active powers that you wouldn't expect an organization that's just supposed to gather information, which there's enough problems with how they gather information and what they gather and what they do with that. Mm-hmm. But now they're being granted powers to interfere with people's movements, with their communications, which really raises questions of, are we going back in time? Are we going back to a time where a security service that operates in secret, even more so in secret than the RCMP does today, is being given these kind of, I guess what the government likes to call kinetic powers, so real world powers where they're actually affecting people and not just kind of spying and surveilling and gathering information.
And I think there was more interest by the media into security intelligence. Once this whole thing about the dirty tricks broke out, there were all kinds of reporters writing articles, and then you had Ian Adams write a spy novel. It was not literally about that, but it was sort of, this is the 90s, but there was all this. There was a lot of interest. I feel there's less interest today. I think it's been a challenge. I mean, it is. You'd agree. It is a challenge to raise issues about certain kind of surveillance and activity.
It is a challenge, and I think, in some ways, people have become kind of almost blasé about that. They just expect that they're being surveilled, and even I think when Edward Snowden came out with the revelations of just how broad the mass surveillance apparatus of the United States and Canada's involvement in that, when that came out, it did shock people. But then when it came down to the choice of, do we change how we interact online and the communication tools, and how do we protect ourselves against it, it's been difficult to kind of keep pushing that forward and keep the media's interest in the idea that this information that's being collected is the way it's being collected and how it's being held on to is dangerous and is endangering people's rights.
Yeah, maybe it's because the people are in certain parts of the population. Well, in the 70s, it seemed like it was a lot of young people, maybe it was just a broader group of people that seemed to be targeted.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's more target.
It could be. I think as people understand how broad the surveillance is, so that's made something else about the new legislation and new powers that CSIS has been legally given. You know, we found out in 2016 that for 10 years CSIS had been collecting vast databases of information that weren't related to active investigations. They would kind of do their surveillance activities, and they were supposed to keep the information narrowly related to the work that they were doing and the investigations they were doing, but get rid of everything else. But they were actually holding on to that information, and that came out because of a judge who decided to look into it, and basically, eventually it was revealed. And it caused a bit of controversy at the time in 2016. And CSIS was supposed to put that on hold and stop what they were doing. And then we get new legislation in 2017 that legalizes exactly what CSIS have been found to be doing illegally for the last 10 years, that they would be allowed to now start with authorization from the minister, but be able to hold on to information that wasn't related to the active specific investigations and what they're calling now datasets. So they have foreign information datasets, Canadian datasets, and one of the ones that we're the most concerned about is what they're calling public information datasets, publicly available information datasets. So that's information that they can collect that they judge doesn't have an expectation of privacy. And that's where we start getting into these concerns of social media and information that we share publicly online that we want to share. We want to share with our friends, and that we want to share publicly with family members and about the work that we're doing. And that we consent to be shared amongst ourselves, but we don't know that the government is interested in collecting that information. And so when we talk about the RCMP developing a file on someone based on their social media posts, the government sees that as being publicly available information, that's fair game to now collect and keep and be able to then access later on if they believe that it should be further investigated. The way that it's being put from security agencies is that the more technical term is that they want total information awareness, so being able to know all the information that surrounds, so they can identify, the way they put it is that they can identify threats. But the more, I think, the more common way they put in, the easier to understand, is that they say they want to build the haystack so they can find the needle. So they're not happy with just when looking around for a threat and looking, and being able to identify a threat. They want to collect as much information as they can to then analyze it and find that one threat within all this information that isn't threat related. And it raises serious concerns about privacy and about freedom of expression. We know there's a chilling effect when people know that they're being surveilled, and I can't remember if you get into it as much in the book, but we know, that when people involved in progressive organizations or groups that challenge the status quo, or even just, faith-based groups, people practicing their religion, if they know they're being surveilled, they hold back and they don't get as involved in organizing or speaking their mind. And
that's right. In the interviews, that what happens, you have a visit from a security intelligence officer. It's very intimidating. You may not want to get involved anymore. And the one person that was a professor who had received a visit, and he said to me, he laughed it off, because he was asked these questions. For example, there was a guy named Mel Watkins, who was quite a well-known professor at U of T, and he was asked by this guy, the person who was being interviewed, his name is Ian Burton. He's not a well-known name. He was a geographer. He worked with Praxis. He received this visit from the RCMP, and he says, and the RCMP officer had a bunch of names. Any of these people planning to overthrow the government? And he gave Mel Watkins and Abraham Ross. These are two professors at U of T. I mean, they're both economists. And they're not really violent people, but it was just this. And so Ian Burton just laughed it off. But what's interesting about the conversation, he's never told anybody, never spoke to anybody about having this conversation. But I interviewed him a few years ago about it, and I guess, I mean, I don't know why but I think it was a little intimidating. It was an intimidating experience. He didn't express it that way, but I think it must have been. And I do have a friend who was called by the RCMP. He was involved with the cruise missile conversion project in the early 80s. And he was told not to tell anybody. But he was called, it was a telephone call, he was asked a bunch of questions, he said, don't tell anybody that I've called you, and that's very intimidating, so he didn't tell anybody, so.
Right. Yeah.
So,
And we know that's continuing today. Over the summer, there were
Yeah.
stories of, concerns about CSIS visits to Muslim student associations, especially at the University of Toronto, to the point where they set up a hotline for students to be able to call to ask, what are my rights if CSIS comes asking me questions? And, if you're part of a student association and you're all of a sudden getting phone calls from CSIS, maybe you stop being involved in your student association or your student union because you don't want to have that trouble. You don't want to be put on a list. Sometimes it feels like a conspiracy theory, but we know from talking to people we work with that they're approached at those times and asked if they'll collaborate with CSIS. And there's been news stories out of the US too of especially people in the Muslim community being approached and asked to collaborate with the FBI, become informants, and they say no, and they're threatened with being placed on watch lists. And we know that people who have said no end up being, all of a sudden having trouble crossing the border or being told that they're on no-fly lists and aren't able to travel. And so that intimidation factor isn't just in people's minds that, that they're kind of imagining that there could be problems if they don't go along with these questions. There are real world impacts to saying no to these organizations.
and on the theme in my book, and I think it's an issue today, is the slowness with which CSIS has taken the threat of the white nationalists and racist groups seriously. I think they're now starting to, particularly with now this Canadian officer has been charged in Virginia, and quite a violent person and what he wanted to do. And he was an explosives expert in Manitoba. But it took CSIS a while to really respond to that. And part of it is, I think that what I say in the book is that I think there was a kind of relationship. It's hard to really describe. I call it murky. That between the RCMP Security Service and the Edmund Burke Society, they were a useful organization. They infiltrated them, and they may have done it. We don't know if they did other things together. I have no idea, but. And they see that you can see a little bit of that today, and so it's just a question to raise that the fact that CSIS has been slow to respond to something that's been going on for a while. That is the kind of white nationalist activity.
Yeah, no, definitely, and we've seen that on our radar, but we can tell from just the priorities that are put out publicly when the annual kind of listing of the priorities for intelligence gathering and threat assessments, that it's constant. This is the first year they included right-wing extremism in that assessment, but continues to, the main focus is on quote-unquote Islamic threats and Islamic terrorism, adding Sikh and Khalistani,
Right.
Indian terrorism to the list now, and that continues to be the main focus.
There's an expert, Barbara Pierre, who you may know, who is an expert on white nationalists, and she works at, I believe it's University in Oshawa, and she wanted to do lectures with CSIS, and it took them a while and they wouldn't respond to her for a while, and it took a few years, and I think that now she's getting some response. But
is there anything else you'd like to add about the book before we kind of go to questions?
Well,
from people?
I think it's an interesting read. It's disturbing, but it is in the past. But it's all about, the 60s was a really interesting period. I do talk about, just what the act, it was, people were involved. It was the concept of community organizing was invented in the 60s. It came out of the U.S. It came to Canada, and we had our own flavor of it. So I tried to make this thing interesting. I did interview university scholars and ex-Mounties and some of these characters in the Edmund Burke Society. But I think it's an interesting read, and I hope you take a chance on it.
Thanks, Paul. And with that, I guess we'll open it up to any questions people have. You can just
The episode of the barn in Sherbrooke is documented. That's a fact. It was part of the McDonald's Commission and then led to the creation of CSIS. I'm wondering if the episode at Praxis was investigated during the McDonald's Commission.
Well, this was something Paul Copeland was trying to do. He was a lawyer for Praxis, And he kept writing to the McDonald Commission, will you let me appear before the McDonald Commission and discuss this? And they said they were collecting their own information, they didn't need to have any special hearing on it. So, and there was a guy named Pierre who was a well-known scholar actually, UT, he's often interviewed, his specialty is the Constitution. And he was director of research at the McDonald Commission, and he had been involved with Praxis actually. And he said that it just wasn't a priority, and so they never really whether they fully investigated or not. I do have some internal memos where they discussed Praxis that I was able to get, but they didn't. They basically accepted They did accept it was something illegal, that the Mounties had held onto these files illegally, and that perhaps there was a legal case, but then they said, well, but politically speaking, the Attorney General of Ontario had the right not to go ahead and lay charges, which he had the right to do. So they basically, so I have this little debate that goes on within the McDonald Commission, that they were debating whether there was a legal case against the RCMP and people could be put on trial for accepting stolen documents, which most of us, if we did that, would be charged. And so, but they concluded because this was national security, no one would go ahead and be charged. So officially, they said nothing to Paul Copeland. You don't need to come before us. We're dealing with it internally, but internally there was debate about it. But that's about it.
And I think maybe one thing on that is also that the question was always just about accepting the stolen documents. It was never about who committed the burglary, who set the fire, or anything
That's
like
right.
that. But you did, maybe not revealing too much, but that they did discover in after searching through the building after the fire that the lines were tapped.
The line, that's right. I do have a memo. That they reported that the line was tapped, that a burglary happened, and they even report that Praxis people were concerned about a particular journalist had written stories about Praxis that it may have inspired the burglars to do that's one possibility. So so I did have an internal memo about the burglary, but it didn't. Often what happens, you get these internal memos. There's a lot of blank spaces, so I don't have everything, but there's enough there to quote from it also.
We'll go you and then next.
Yeah. When CSIS was split off from the RCMP, they also set up the Security Intelligence Review Committee to monitor CSIS and any potential that doesn't seem to have worked very well. So I can speak about my own case.
Well, that's right. And there was they can make recommendations. The process is not transparent. And that there's a new body that's been formed that's supposed to be more transparent, I would say.
Well, they're not actually So I wouldn't say that they'll be more transparent. They're actually, the rules are in terms of their transparency are the same as what CERC was operating under. They're able to look across the board. So it's a National Security Intelligence Review Agency. They're able to not just look at CSIS, but are allowed to look at CSIS and the RCMP and the Communication Security Establishment that does foreign intelligence gathering. So it breaks out of those silos, but the same rules that kept CERC findings secret, that keeps a complaints process secret, that still is all, it's essentially a copy-paste from the CERC legislation. You said you had your own experience with CERC or your own?
Well, I spent 7 years in the courts with CSIS over denial of a security clearance at Agriculture Canada in '84. Okay. The short version is that after going through, CERC recommended that the government give me the job. Government refused to. We went down to the Federal Court of Appeal, down to the Federal Court Trial Division, back to the Federal Court of Appeal, and eventually to the Supreme Court, which ruled that the CERC legislation said that they could make recommendations to the government, and recommendations, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, don't have to be followed. Therefore, essentially, at least with respect to security clearances, not giving CERC any authority.
Mm-hmm. And that's similar for everything. CERC is they could never order CSIS to take on something. It would, if a judge found that CSIS was breaking the law, then they'd have to be forced to change. But none of CERC's recommendations were ever binding, and it's the same situation with the NSIRA now, that they can't make binding recommendations. And one of the things that we have trouble with is it's very hard. They'll make a recommendation, CSIS will say yes, we accept it or don't accept it, but it's very hard to know if they accept it, what the outcome is. You know, what is it that they've done to actually fix the problem that was identified? You know, you might know that there's a vague issue, that they won't go into specifics because of national security reasons, and then it's unclear how they follow up on it. So that's still an issue.
The changes, they've appointed people, it makes it look more promising, but the issue is what they can do with.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, they have a guy named Craig Forsey, who's a quite respected academic. They have Murray Rankin, a former NDP MP. I mean, but they still have there's limitation in what they can do, you're saying.
Yeah, and a good example that's been in the news is what's being dubbed the protest papers. So in 2014, the BC Civil Liberties Association, representing several environmental groups on the West Coast and Indigenous groups, filed a complaint with CERC against CSIS for spying on environmental activists. And the complaint was taken up, and they went to CERC, and the review was done. CERC found that CSIS was operating within the law and basically dismissed the claim. But the catch was that the groups obviously disagreed with the finding, and they felt it was flawed. And they said, okay, well, we want to talk about this publicly. And the CERC member in charge of that hearing said, well, no, according to the legislation, it says that these hearings take place in private. And so because they're private, you can't reveal anything that was divulged in these hearings. And so that came up as the hearings were happening. So they even asked, so if we say this publicly, you know, if we say something publicly before the hearing, before we go in, we can say it then, but then once we're in a hearing and we say it, then we're never able to repeat that publicly again. And the answer was yes. You know, you're basically bound by secrecy once you start participating in these hearings, which was, from what I understand, the first time it had been interpreted that way, that you couldn't, if you were bringing a complaint against CSIS, that once you actually go into a hearing, then that complaint and everything you've written up as a complainant couldn't be shared publicly. So they've actually brought that, they're challenging the decision, but also they're challenging the overall decision, but also this declaration that everything has to be kept in private at the federal court right now. And so the reason we're even able to talk about it and know some more of the information is because now that's gone to court, there has to be disclosure, and that disclosure is public. So now there's thousands of pages of what CERC was analyzing that's being made public, heavily redacted. There's black marks everywhere. But if you do look at it, it becomes very clear that yes, they were gathering thousands upon pages about, you know, non-violent legal activities by environmental and indigenous organizations, but they say that wasn't undue surveillance. That was just information gathering so they could understand what the context was, and that they had to hold on to it. So that's still going through the courts, but the secrecy issue is still there, and the rules haven't changed with the new National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. They still have those same rules that they're following.
Just one small thing, that the Supreme Court, in my case, ruled that if the government wanted CERC to have authority, they should change the legislation using the word recommendation. Mm-hmm. And they made quite a strong recommendation in that regard. And there was one opposing opinion that was even stronger still, and the government never followed through on it.
I wonder if the problem is we haven't had whistleblowers like a comparable Edward Snowden, a Canadian version of Edward Snowden, coming out of CSIS, exposing things and risking jail. And there aren't having that. There are some whistleblowers. I don't know if the penalties are worse in Canada than they are in the U.S., but maybe it's a cultural thing. We just not had people who come out of these organizations very often, writing books.
There's a question over there.
Yeah, this is a research question. I haven't read your book yet, but I will. But but I know that at Library and Archives, if someone makes an information request, an AKIP request, and it is fulfilled, then that information is available for other people to go and look at without having to make a request themselves.
Right.
And at the archives, there are a handful of files I've noticed looking for other things that are about Praxis.
Right.
So I'm just curious to know in your case, are those the files you used, or were you the person who maybe made the access request?
I made the request, and anyone is welcome. As I say in the book, if you want to you can check anything that I've written that comes out of those files. And
So
then
those
anyone-
were your requests, and that's why the
a large
information's
number of
there.
are probably my, and there's all kinds of things, you can get a list of what's been requested.
Did you have access to other sources as well through this, about the security service, or was that it?
Well, I interviewed a former senior officer in the security service, and I could not mention his name, he'd be in trouble, and I think years later, even though this ancient history, he'd be in trouble. And I say he's a man because there was a time when women could not join the security service. This was a period of time when it was all male. And the Hindenburg Society, I managed to track down 2 members, interviewed them. One of them was a little more forthcoming than the other one. The one who was more forthcoming, he felt put upon that he was never allowed to become a senior member of the group, so he was disgruntled, so it was easier to talk to him actually. But so yeah, it was just as the normal reporting things, just phoning people and looking for people. But yeah, so and the poverty side was fairly easy because there'd be a few people around, like in Hamilton. There was a young man, well, he's not young anymore, he's in his almost 80, but he was involved with the welfare rights group then, and his conflict with City Hall, so all that stuff, yeah, it's all just a daily kind of reporting, like phoning people, bugging people.
Any other questions that people have? No? Okay, maybe we'll end it there.
Okay,
Is
so
there anything else you'd like to add, or?
I guess that's it. Any more if you're interested in buying a book, I'll sign it.
Yeah, and I'll stick around too, and people can, or feel free to stay here a little bit longer and chat if you have any questions for Paul or I, we can talk some more. And
Sure.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.